Michael Gira's 1994 collection of short stories, The Consumer, is the most agonizing and treacherous piece of art I've ever seen through to the end. It took me over 2 months to complete because it's just so miserable. Nearly every word is dirty, upsetting, disgusting, and perverted, constantly subverting your expectations and getting more vile as it goes on. But I think it's an amazing piece of art, and I want to skim through a few of its complexities. But first, we need some context. Michael Gira was born in 1954 in California, where he lived with his alcoholic mother. After being arrested multiple times, primarily on drug-related accounts, he was sent to live with his father in Germany. After some time, he ran away from his dad with some hippies, still doing drugs and living in a damp, abandoned building. He was arrested for drugs again and placed in jail for a short period, getting bailed out by his father soon after.
My father told me later that he had located me through Interpol. He spoke to the police, and he said, just leave him in jail for 2 weeks.
Yeah? When Gira returned home, he worked in a tool factory for a year, then ran away again after his father forced him to go to school. This time, Michael went to Israel. There, he was arrested selling hash in an apartment and was sent to another prison, this time one for adults, in Jerusalem at the age of 15. He said that multiple Palestinian prisoners who had been tortured somehow ended up in his cell at certain points, but he didn't elaborate beyond that. Eventually, Gira got out and worked in a copper mine where he met a woman named Lena who convinced him to go back to his father. After returning one last time, Michael passed high school by way of a standardized test without attending any classes. He used this to get into art school, which he quit right before graduating. Following this, he has a long and detailed history of making intensely countercultural stories and music, the first band that took off being Swans. Working in New York under crushing poverty, they released their first record in 1983, Filth. While Filth is extremely relevant, being created at the same time as many of The Consumer's stories, I think that The Consumer provides an interesting foundation to discuss Filth alongside it, so we'll go over that first. The most immediately striking thing about The Consumer is just how gross it is. Gross is an understatement, actually. I'd reckon at least 50% of this book is only words designed to make you gag or give up reading it. Its short story format allows for a lot of grotesque details, plenty of minor things that make everything feel completely rotted. And I don't get the feeling that these things contribute to a greater point within the book or within the stories. It's all just there. But the fact that it's meaningless is what gives it meaning. A single shout into darkness, signifying nothing, is its own kind of artistic expression. The two boys sat on rocks in the dry stream that emptied into the wide black mouth of the drainage pipe. The blond boy dug with a stick into the stones and pebbles on the floor of the bed, revealing a greasy, damp layer of fine sand mixed with bits of colored plastic and broken glass. The fertile smell of trapped urine and polluted gutter water rose up from the fresh tear in the hardened surface. Giant reeds of wild grass and bamboo formed a meshed jungle wall on either side of the bleached rocks. Woven into the dense latticework of foliage were dried tumbleweeds, yellowing newspapers, the shredded, unraveling pink sweater of a child, a rotted bird carcass crucified in the weeds, a torn and faded tennis shoe, all washed or thrown in towards the drainage ditch from the road above. The road crawled within a broken chain of traffic that stretched from horizon to horizon and gushed a low-hanging mixture of dust and opaque black exhaust. This excerpt, and others like it, are amazing to me. You have to keep in mind, this is not the long opening to a book, it's the meat of a short story that ends after a few pages. It's like a whole other kind of writing, one within a natural order of sentence structures and thought communication. It doesn't give full closure to any ideas while moving at a weirdly stilted and quick pace. It also has a disconnected and unemotional tone, never describing the precise emotional reactions of any characters, not to a normal degree at least. It goes beyond your typical third-person limited perspective by reading as dry and distant, even in some stories where it's in first person, but it still uses such flowery language. Flowery's the wrong term. Maybe mossy? Grimy? The fertile smell of trapped urine is such a unique and prevalent kind of description in this book, but there's no reaction from the narration or characters. It just immediately moves on to the urban decay within the surrounding nature. There's no justification for the grime, and no time to process anything. The tight-faced narrator gives long, leathery lists of mildewed adjectives and nouns. Here's an excerpt from another one of my favorite stories. With no place to hide from the increasing intensity of the sun, and the boredom of just standing there intolerable, they advanced, sweating and groaning unconsciously, hacking and prying at the desert crust. Inching steadily towards the flag, their bodies struggle and grind against gravity and resistance, absorbing the heat without feeling as their insides begin to stew. Their minds pump out waves of ornately detailed sensation, fueled by the opium and the wine and the sun. sending them falling through layers of color and warmth that expand as liquid, withdrawal, and heat, then spread out through their bodies like the exploratory vines of a sexually omnivorous parasite rooted deep in the base of their stomachs, guiding magma streams of pleasure through arid veins and crackling nerves out into their half-numb extremities and fingers, which then tingle with current as if waking from sleep. It's an enthralling and mystical description of opium-fueled physical labor in the desert, which is what the entire story is about. It will dedicate so much time and thought to banalities, minuscule things like the heat of the sun, the feeling in their stomachs, the texture of the desert floor, instead of telling a primary story and using surrounding details as flavor. In The Consumer, the primary focus is all of the surrounding details. Nearly all of these stories have no solid plot, and when they do, it could be described as one person going from point A to point B, or somebody sitting in a room detailing how they've acted and felt over the past few minutes. But these minutes are so focused in that it feels like an entire life story. A full-page story dedicated to a tiny incident makes the world entirely centered on the weak and untrustworthy mind of some depraved person for no reason but to be perverse, shocking, and indicative of rot. This is what I believe to be The Consumer. It's a permeating and insulated consumption within the book. A consumption of emotional, ethical, and moral principles. The principles that created us. Sometimes I'm able to lose myself for days in here, drifting through a universe of disconnected images, shining flesh, brightly colored consumer products, blissfully escalating waves of anxiety. My mind is washed clean with light. I heroically refuse to allow any real memories or desires to enter me. I go with the flow, floating through the neon plastic stream, cannibalized and carcinogenic, my veins rushing with toxic chemicals. When I sleep, my dreams mingle with scenes generated from the screen, like sewage discharged into the Black Sea inside my room. I think this consumption is a young and unsatisfied manner of lashing out at the earth. Gira is reacting against everything that leaves him unwhole. This is absolutely a punk sentiment, a gross and explosive anger for counterculture's sake. I say this despite Gira's dislike of punk. In regards to his first album, he said, "In a way, it was a reaction against punk and the conservative notion that 3 chords were somehow necessary." Gira was interested in provoking what he felt in others, destructive dissatisfaction, or, as I'm calling it, consumption. It's extremely hard to demonstrate the consumption's presence even in such long excerpts like the ones that I showed you. A key aspect of it is the length over which it presides, in long, thick strands of twiny rot across every word, page, and idea. In a sense, the book is an exploration of consumption in 2 distinct forms, the consuming and the consumed. I've mostly shown you excerpts from what I would consider the consumed, the first half of the book written from 1993 to 1994. That section is desolate, decayed, and friendless. The second half, what I would consider the consuming, written from 1983 to 1986, focuses on a much more primal filth and frustration. This ordering gives the reader a reverse chronology of events, starting at the decayed and working backwards into the source, the consumer's beating black heart, and also Gira's young, fiery passion. I believe this book's final story to be a prime example of the consumer. Titled, "I'm an Infant, I Worship Him," the story is the most disgusting of them all, the most visceral and psychosexual. It's rotting, decaying, and positively consuming. I won't read you any excerpts for my own sake, but you can find it on page 222 of the PDF that I've linked in the description to this video. I would have gotten myself a physical copy, but it seems that they've become a bit of a collector's item. You can also find an old recording of Gira reading this story.
I'm bloated. I'm soft. I weigh 349 pounds. I'm fat scum. I despise myself.
The broad strokes of the story go as follows. Our character is extremely unhygienic, a trait that we hear a lot about, and he takes sexual pleasure in his own filth. He wanders around detailing his dirtiness and decadence, then kidnaps a homeless man who is being lit on fire by some school kids. He takes the man to an abandoned building and eats his intestines, among other things. I won't go into more detail, but it's more perverted than how I described it. It's partially owed to Gira's details and descriptions, but also to the stuffy, thick, scald stream of consciousness writing. Psychosexuality is probably this book's most glaring characteristic, exemplified in this story, but I'm not too keen on going into detail on it for obvious reasons. Just know that basically every story involves twisted, fetishistic, and, for lack of a better word, degenerate sexual desires. I don't believe that Michael Gira holds these sexual desires, but that they communicate the consumer in its most distilled and visceral sense. When reading, I'm not only disgusted by this book's warped sexuality and grime, but satisfied by its gruesome desire. There's another aspect of the consumer shown off by this story, the major disregard that every character has for their own well-being, either through empty-headedness or intense masochism. This book is filled to the brim with characters casually harming themselves, sometimes severely, losing fingers, limbs, intestines, eyeballs. Nothing is of consequence. Characters just don't have the presence within reality to feel the weight of any actions, usually only ever in a state of pleasant misery. Under normal circumstances, that would make a book worse, but these are not normal circumstances. This book's prime directive is to shock and consume. But, of course, Gira never says any of that in the book. He doesn't talk about the pervasive consumption, the satisfaction of viscera, the derealization of isolation. This is a book that gets across its ideas secondhand. Rather than being a book directly about the consumer, it winds up as a book displaying the gritty impacts of the consumer, only showing fragments of what is and is being consumed. I want to put a bit of emphasis on my favorite story now that I've explained the essence of the book. It's sort of a self-titled story, The Consumer, Rotting Pig. It follows the thoughts and circumstances of someone named Rotting Pig, whose name is self-explanatory. It's 100 degrees in my room. There's no windows here. The air conditioner's always on and blows in hot, moldy air. I leave it on because the thick, ripe quality of the air feels good. It's alive. Creatures breed in it. The mechanical droning and rattling of the machine drowns out any sounds that might otherwise infiltrate from the street, out in the sickening yellow sunlight. I actually already shared another excerpt from this story, because it, fittingly, encapsulates the book very well. But apart from the typical horrid atmosphere, it contains something that's very common in the consumer, the consumption of self, a kind of ego death. The story has multiple subsections, the first titled, My Prescription for Happiness by the Rotting Pig. In order to solve the problem of my mind's awareness of itself and its persistent refusal to be completely disintegrated, I've developed an idea that would allow me to lose any sense of where I begin or end. I'd be suspended naked in a container of warm blood, kept at body temperature. My mouth would be sewn shut, my ears sealed with wax. I'd be completely submerged in the blood and would breathe through tubes running down my otherwise sealed nostrils into my lungs. A machine would pump my lungs for me, so no effort would be involved in breathing. My eyelids having been removed, a set of eyepieces would be secured over my eyes and then sewn directly into the surrounding flesh. These eyepieces would transmit images directly into my eyes, straight into my brain without distraction. The images would be triggered or generated by me, without my awareness of the fact I was doing so. There would be wires and electrodes leading into my brain, which would in turn lead to a computer. The computer would interpret the electrical impulses as images, events, visual scenarios, and eventually histories, civilizations, galaxies, emptiness. My brain would immediately and involuntarily respond to stimulus before the interjection of my will, and would instantaneously signal new stimulus and response endlessly. For the rest of this story, it goes into further detail on this plan, as well as similar, more medieval blueprints for ego death. It's quite obviously gruesome, but it feels strange reading something so extravagant with such a bitter, empty attitude. The attitude this portrays, a clearly frustrated and unhappy one so deep and unwell, stewing, fermenting. It makes me relate to Gira, which is something that's amazing about this book. The consumer is so primal and raw, it doesn't really subscribe to any standards of quality, instead opting for guttural shouts of anguish. Now, with a good explanation of consumption under our belt, filth. This is all slabs of sound, rhythm and screaming testifying. What more do you need? I used to dislike 1983's filth quite a lot. I couldn't even make it through without turning it off. It's a painful experience. But just like the consumer, it pulled me along, and I discovered something amazing. That same visceral consumption present in the consumer is writhing freely in filth. Just look at some of these lyrics. Use sex for control, use power for power, use money for cruelty, use hate for freedom, take control and keep it. And listen to how this song sounds, how it feels.
Take control and keep it.
When screamed over such harsh instrumentals, it communicates such filthy rage. It really touches my soul a little. And that's what I love about Filth. It's reaching towards my soul with such anger, angst, fervor, and discontentment. Very little art is so confident. It's as if Gira sets out a challenge on every early project. It challenges you to bear witness to consumption and make it out the other end, and I find that challenge absolutely thrilling. So much media is produced just to emulate what's come before, a song that sounds like another, a movie that's written, shot, directed just like a previous, a video, say, that's as cliche as the rest. But very few artworks are willing to fight off everyone who's not prepared. And for this reason, Swans is not an incredibly profitable or popular venture. If 100 people showed up, 80 were guaranteed to leave by the second song. When there are profit incentives in art... No, I was just self-aware, I can't be cliched now. Swans followed up Filth with Cop, Young God, Greed, and Holy Money. I'm grouping these all together because I don't have anything unique to say about these albums, but I'll share a few highlights with you. It gets increasingly bare as you go on, I feel. These 5 albums share quite a bit of stylistic similarity, all fervently consuming and destroying, but I do notice something. Something more raw and skeletal within the end of this batch. It's cold and self-loathing, reverberating and empty. It feels a little more consumed, no? Filth feels like a red-hot expression of rage, but this feels a little more pale. At this point, Swans carves their path in a different direction, moving away from such harsh industrial sounds into something more traditional. Children of God, released 1987, and The Burning World, released 1989, are folk albums. The latter, The Burning World, is the undoubtable black sheep of the Swans discography. It's nearly unanimously agreed to be the worst Swans album, even by Gira himself. It's not particularly terrible, it's just not what Swans is supposed to be. It's just kind of music. There's no exceptional qualities. There's no consumption. It's paradoxically interesting to talk about, because its lack of consumption is a primary reason that it's not interesting. It just goes to show that Gira's consumption is a primary driving force of his good art, which is further illustrated by White Light from the Mouth of Infinity. This album is beautiful. It's amazingly arranged and produced, well written, and melancholic in just the right way. It's shocking how in such little time Gira went from making the loudest, roughest industrial around to making gorgeous folk songs. Not the smoothest transition, but it's a miracle that it worked at all. And I'm going to spoil this for a second. They go back to making noisy and experimental music after 2 more folk albums after this, which makes the detour all the more weird. But I'm not complaining, it's a wonderful record. It also marks what I would definitely consider a more consumed style seeping into the band as opposed to a consuming one. Compare something so dreamy like Love Will Save You to an earlier track and it's incredibly stark.
Love will save you from the snake that crawls around down there, but it won't.
I believe contrasts like this in music can create an extremely powerful effect. As an example of this, Death Grips. I'm not a Death Grips fan if I don't bring them up constantly. The Powers That Be, a double album released in 2014, has 2 discs that are so strongly opposed to each other it's a defining characteristic of the album. With my limited genre vocabulary, I'd call Disc 1 menacing experimental electronic hip-hop, and Disc 2 some kind of punk Death Grips thing. I'm not so sure. Needless to say, they're different. It's all the better because the 2 most different points in the album are placed right next to each other. Something like an anti-transition. I'll share it with you now. I personally think this makes the album a much more engaging experience, not overstaying its welcome because it's so abrasive and noisy, by switching it up to something else entirely. That's kind of what Swans did with folk. They sprinkled an entirely different genre into their discography just as I felt their industrial material was getting a little bit used up. The particular thematic effect here is that it feels as though all the energy was expended through consumption, and all that's left is a melancholic, consumed skeleton. The next two albums follow White Light closely stylistically, so I won't go over them in much detail. Love of Life is the direct successor to White Light, and is generally less acclaimed, but I feel like it has a few great aspects. The Great Annihilator is significantly more decayed. I like Brad Taste's description of it as sun-dried. It's more rotten, miserable, and consumed. You can almost see how this leads into their next release, their final before an over 10-year hiatus, and my absolute favorite. Soundtracks for the Blind is the most terrifying album ever made. I've cried multiple times while listening to this album, and I get chills the moment I hear certain tracks. This album reaches into me and holds my heart, cold and steady for its entire 2.5-hour duration. It's a blizzard, a depressive whirlwind of noise, decay, crippled memories, and infinite reverberations. Everything is consumed and hollow. This project is a long and unbroken gaze, a mix between indecipherably crafted ambience and post-rock with samples from the bandmates' personal lives spliced in. Things from the past, recollections, only fragments of recordings that fit into something bigger that we never see. We hear a woman describe what sounds like sex work, a man explaining his blindness, a happy child, all splintered memories. My favorite word to describe this album is pale. It's how I describe a certain feeling media can provide. A feeling that makes art into something magical and emotional. That blind, decayed sadness is the core of this album, and it's why it's so haunting. It builds from sorrowful droning to thick, horrifying noise pounding through my body. Endless ink could be spilled in adoration of this album, but I want to finish off by talking about how this fits into the consumer framework. Without having created such a perfect work of art, I would assume that the consumer was Gira fruitlessly flinging his tears onto a page. However, knowing that the book was written by someone who has made music that feels like this, that changes how I feel about it. It's still tears on a page, but they hold intent. They hold value and meaning. The terrible writing is a vessel for such interesting feelings. The consuming and the consumed, it's a microcosm of the Swans discography. From filth to here, we've progressed from gritty, thumping shouts to a pale wasteland. That's what I wanted to say, that the consumer is a map through consumption in the Swans discography. But I don't think the map quite ends there. If you're in for a more thorough look, a more crackpot theory, and a few more twists and turns, then let's look forward.
There's this person I call Joseph, who has been the sort of puppeteer of me for my entire life. And he's an entity that speaks through me on occasion. Many of the songs are written through him. I mean, it's like once, if I play guitar for a couple hours, maybe Joseph will decide to inhabit my body.
Swans' 2012 Deicide the Seer is The Devil. It's Joseph, the primordial consumer. I'm going to spill the plot here because it's the quickest summary of the album I can manage. I believe this album is a story about Satan, or some equivalent, inhabiting our character in order to kill God. It constantly references something possessing Gira, gesturing towards an entity inside of him. The album starts with the song Lunacy, talking about nurturing a beast within and childhood ending, a metaphor for a kind of satanic rebirth. The specific wording is very cultish. I can imagine this is what a cohort of zealots would say as they sacrifice someone to a higher power. Since this is the first track, its structure and soundscape are the most recognizable out of the whole album, and it has the most straightforward lyrics. We haven't yet delved into madness. After this point, however, it's more abstract. In the following track, Mother of the World, there are only 10 lines of lyrics in 10 minutes that don't seem to reference anything extremely specific. This harkens back to Gira's earlier consumption that communicates itself through layers of abstraction, a theme that's heavily reinforced from this point on. Instead of lyrics that specifically reference being consumed into Joseph, Satan, the devil, whatever we're calling it, we hear what seems to me more like cultish rambling. Again, what I'd imagine a cult member saying about the events I describe, not the events directly. But after the harsh onslaught of noise from that song, the album quiets down into something suspiciously mellow.
Now feed me through.
The Wolf is a minimalistic track that sounds like Gira submitting himself further to Joseph. It also leads into the title track, with a very sharp anti-transition. We hard cut from ambience to noisy bagpipes that slowly distort and becomes drowned out by indecipherable screeches and plucks. Those sounds also fade away into a slow-moving and intricate arrangement of instruments that builds in layers over the track's 32-minute runtime. Despite the vagueness of these words, I have a strong feeling this is the point when Gira truly absorbs into Joseph, or vice versa. The next track, The Seer Returns, is another track like Lunacy, more comprehensible and straightforward. Gira's vocals also have a different tint, showing that he's changed somehow. When he sings, "Your light pours into my mouth, my light pours into your mouth," we can't know whether it's him or Joseph speaking. In fact, it's both. Since Joseph and Gira are fusing, that line works no matter who's saying it, a kind of palindrome. As we get further through the album, we can notice more instances of ambiguity of voice as assimilation continues. Skipping ahead a little, past two great tracks, Song for a Warrior changes things up a lot. It's a very somber and beautiful song with soft female vocals and acoustic guitar. It's a different voice with a completely different soundscape and perspective from what we've heard so far. The lyrics, however, are slightly terrifying.
Some people say God is long dead, but I heard something inside you with my head to your chest.
It grounds the listener back in reality, contrasting the harsh and discordant jabs of the rest of the album with the realism of acoustic guitars. It also provides a third party to speak about the horror of what's happening to Gira. After another lyrical palindrome, we get something very pale. Note the fire that opens this track, something that suggests destruction as Joseph completes his consumption of Gira. But this is different from the consumed Swans of the past. After a familiar 15-minute wasteland, we reach something strangely calm, an oasis. Not calm in a depraved sense, like soundtracks to the blind. Calm in an innocent sense. Of course, that doesn't come without a catch. The lyrics gleefully sing the least comprehensible lines yet, the standout being,
In the now that is not, on a ladder to God, on a mountain strip bare, with your hand in my hair.
This paints a picture of Gira, now replaced by Joseph, in a demolished world where the only place left is up to God. So, we're at the final track, the culmination of everything so far. The instrumentals are layered, pounding, brilliant, and demolishing. Gira screams out in a final jolt against Joseph, who screams back what he's already said. The lyrics escalate with the instrumental, getting more intense and scattered as the instruments mushroom into a mess of frustration and acidic spite, a kind of malice that only exists in bloody murder. We're hearing the final stages of a cult's plan to summon the devil and kill God. The result? God is dead and Swans has killed him. To Be Kind is an album, in my opinion, about a godless world, one with nothing but lethargy and apathy, pointless feeling and wanting and yearning, a mess of human anatomy and emotion, a universe that sings in reverse.
Oh, universe, singing rivers.
This is an album filled from bottom to top with visceral words like love, hate, and fuck. On a track like Some Things We Do, we hear the most primal actions of humanity in no particular order, the only actions that would be possible under a godless world.
We see, we feel, we need, we fight.
On the closer, the title track, we hear of someone trying to ground themselves in something.
To be lost, to be found in the sound of this room.
It weeps out of desire to feel like a person, to feel like something actual unconscious, more than just a flurry of senses directed by organs, but it keeps coming back around to meaninglessness. I think this depiction of godlessness is a gorgeous continuation of Gira's previous bitterness and consumption. It more succinctly and poetically describes something so horrifying. This album exists rhetorically at a downright limbic level of existence, so it doesn't reach a complicated rhetorical space at first pass. However, looking at a line like, "May moonlight fall upon your breast, may God send wind to lick your lips," we can uncover a nugget of information. Not only is it an extremely elegant and well-written lyric, but actually pretty thematically interesting. It's a line that represents how God, now Joseph, controls the light in the wind that interacts with what we lust after, and illuminates it in our mind. I've listened to this album dozens of times, totaling a time significantly longer than how long I've spent dying to the Celeste Core seasides. It took me like 5 days to beat this screen, but I'm still able to look at any given line and derive new meaning every time I hear it. It's the deepest album I've ever come across, an absolute Dunning-Kruger that has an endless amount of meaning tucked away under every moment of its 2 hours while still being extremely spread apart and ambient at times. But when it's not ambient, this is one of the most full-body albums in existence. Gira has absolutely mastered the art of acceleration and enormity. I strongly recommend you take on this whole album yourself, if you can. Swans continue on their quest for gigantism in 2016's The Glowing Man, another 2-hour-long epic that leans further into post-rock than their previous work, being much less explosive and varied than To Be Kind or The Seer. This album is sonically one of their most grandiose and polished, and lyrically tight-lipped. It reads almost like a boots-on-the-ground look at the world of To Be Kind, anecdotes and gritty tragedies. It's a lot like Soundtracks for the Blind in those ways, an ambient and post-rock collection of fractured anecdotes. The difference is that The Glowing Man is far more refined. Moving into specifics, the title track, both a centerpiece and a closer, is 28 minutes long. At about 7 minutes and 30 seconds, the song bursts into a trail of chords, thick and metallically resonant, engulfing and igniting exponentially with each slam of the strings and strike of the percussion, as if it were flint ballooning a monolithic steel conflagration. It slowly raises in pitch and intensity, then returns back to the starting point with more percussion, more fire and anger, eventually crashing down from its peak into an intertwining rubble of instrumentation that slowly fizzles into embers. At 12 minutes 40 seconds, just as you thought it was over, gaseous pockets within the substrate ignite into finalized, assimilated fireballs of sound. After several breaths, a figure emerges from the settling dust. The glowing man.
Joseph is standing behind my back. Joseph is digging his hands in my chair.
This is the immediate aftermath of Joseph's possession of Gira.
I am a glowing man, I am. I am a glowing man.
We hear Gira change voices in the middle of the track, switching from talking about Joseph inside of him to being a glowing man, a man with the glow of Joseph. At the end of the track, Gira has no perspective in reality left as Joseph controls everything, so he releases one final shout of anguish before the track closes out. Side note, while editing this video, I had to listen to this song again, and unexpectedly it brought me to tears. And I want that fact to speak to how powerful I find it. Side note over. If you don't want to listen to Be Kind, this track is a lower commitment microcosm of what's amazing about contemporary Swans. Out of everything Gira has done, this is the most immediately powerful. It's suitably placed in a climactic point in their discography, a point where the band creatively peaks. I and many others believe that The Glowing Man marks the end of an era for Swans. Their most recent album, Leaving Meaning, simply continues the sound of The Glowing Man without doing anything new like their previous few releases we've discussed. Their latest single is promising, but I heavily doubt their next album will reach the levels of their predecessors. One band can only make so many near-perfect albums. In addition, the members of Swans shift so much that Gira is the only member from the band's start to prevail to the present. Most likely, Swans is past their prime, and I'm comfortable concluding my analysis here. I could very, very easily get into Michael's second collection of short stories, The Egg, which I had to DM a random guy on Reddit in order to access. The themes within The Egg are interesting, elaborating on the consumer and Swans' newest music in lots of neat ways, primarily expanding on derealization and consciousness. I could get into that, but I'm frankly tuckered out. Not only did we cover a book, but an extremely long discography with an interesting history. Gira's tireless creativity over such a long period of time has left an enormous node of thematic and artistic depth buried under an incredible time commitment from anyone who wants to engage, which is kind of interesting. That's something that initially drew me in. The volume. It's immediately interesting to see a cryptic 30-minute song in a 2-hour album, or a downright unlistenable song, or a book that isn't very easy to read. And a lot of it, too. If nothing else, if all of my interpretation doesn't stand to scrutiny, Gira's work stands as a pillar of expression. What else is art but something that provokes emotion? I can't note to what extent what Gira has done is intentional, but it's brilliant nonetheless. The stars were smeared across the black dome above them in wide swaths like titanium paint spread by the dripping hands of a delirious prisoner in a solitary, lightless cell. When I first read this, it felt slippery between my fingers. I felt like this line was deeply interpretable. This line could be used as a broader representation of Gira's work in a self-aware sense. Gira is a delirious author, dripping the literary equivalent of spatters across the consumer, swinging his hands less in accordance with his frontal lobe but rather at the control of his blood and skin, and more widely the prison of his limited status in society. His time is spent in grim environments, lightless, misunderstood. I found this line to be a brilliant and beautiful interjection into an already fabulous story. But was my analysis anything more than panning for theme and coming up with pyrite? At first I thought that's all it was, that I was finding meaning where there was none. But I feel differently now. I don't think we should limit our understanding of art in that way. We shouldn't forego a richer experience or understanding for some unknowable accuracy. We can obtain so much more from media if we stop thinking about it as direct communication through abstraction and start thinking about it as a prism. Somebody may read the consumer and extract a lot of complicated messaging about sex and gender and gain a lot of meaning out of that. Another might get nothing at all. And I think that's amazing. Gira might have had something incredibly specific to say. Look at this gross stuff, he might be saying. But this can refract in a million different ways into a million different meanings that are all amazing. What is the consumer about? That's for you to decide. And I've decided that the consumer is about God, death, consciousness, and hatred. Alright, what's my score? God damn it.